So you've just been out riding with your new Insta360 camera, captured some awesome 360 footage, but now you want to know how to turn that footage into a usable clip that you can share on social media or put in a YouTube video like this. Well, that's exactly what I'm going to show you today, both on your phone and on a computer. I'm going to be focusing on the basics, how you can manually import your footage, choose an aspect ratio, add some keyframes to get some movement in the shot, and how to export to get a good looking clip. I'm not going to be going over any of the AI stuff or fancy effects that can be found in their mobile app, because that is constantly changing, but mostly because I'm old school. I am by no means the best editor in the world, but I have been using these cameras for almost 4 years now, so I've refined my own personal workflow and I use them in almost all of my projects now. So these methods should work for any Insta360 cameras that film in 360, like the X2, X3, R, RS, and hopefully any cameras they release after this video. First, I'm going to show you the workflow on the Insta360 mobile app, because I suspect that is how most enthusiasts are going to want to edit their footage for convenience. And then I'll show you how to do it on the Insta360 Studio app that's available for both Windows and macOS. Personally, I recommend the mobile app for hobbyists, but if you're anything more than that, I highly recommend using the Studio app because it makes your workflow a lot easier when working with programs like Premiere Pro or Final Cut. Let's assume your footage is still on your camera. Now you've got 3 options from there. Option 1, with your camera on and you in the app, go to the album tab at the bottom of the screen, and then in the top right you'll see a camera symbol with the Wi-Fi icon, and if you click that, it'll allow you to connect to your camera. So once you're connected to your camera via Wi-Fi, all the clips that are on the camera will show up on the screen. You could potentially just open the clips right here and start to edit them, but Wi-Fi has a tendency to drop out and is pretty slow since the clips aren't saved on the device, which brings us to option 2. In the album tab, you can then select the clips that you'd like to use and download them to your device. This obviously makes editing them a lot easier because now they're saved to your device, but it does mean that you need a fair bit of storage on your phone, and I can only afford the budget 8GB iPhone. Option 3 is the easiest by far, but it does require you to buy this quick reader from Insta360. But if you're going to be doing this frequently, I promise you it's worth it. So this lets you remove the SD card from the camera and plug it directly into your phone, either via Lightning or USB-C. The clips will then show up instantly in the album tab, and now you can just edit them straight off of the SD card because you have a more reliable connection than Wi-Fi, or you could save them to your device, and this way it'll also be faster to download. So now I'm going to just edit straight off of the SD card using the quick reader because it makes it nice and easy and I don't have to clog up storage on my phone. The first step is to open the clip you want to edit. So I have one on the camera that's got my RS125, and I'm going to edit that clip because I really like the way it looks. So as you open it, the first thing you'll see is the timeline at the bottom where you can add keyframes. Above that, we have a few more controls, and at the top right, you'll see the export button next to 3 dots that'll give you even more options that we'll play with in a minute. The first thing I like to do is set my aspect ratio. So above the timeline at the bottom, second from the left, you'll see a rectangle with 9:16 underneath it. This is where you'll choose your aspect ratio, and they give you 4 options to choose from. So you have 9:16, which is vertical, perfect for phones and social media. Next to that is 16:9, which is perfect for YouTube. You also have an option of 1:1, which is just a square, also great for something like Instagram. And on the far right, you'll have a super wide and short frame, which will look more like a movie. So for this, I'm going to pretend I'm editing it for something like TikTok. So I'm going to stick with 9:16 because it works perfectly on the phone right now. So you always want to get your base settings done before you start adding keyframes, because if you change your base settings after adding keyframes, it could potentially mess up everything you've done before that and you have to re-edit everything, which is frustrating. So the next settings we're going to play with are on the top right with those 3 dots. If you open that, you'll see another bunch of settings under basic. The first one is flow state stabilization. This means that it'll keep your horizon level and it will do exactly that. It'll stabilize your footage. Most of the time you are going to want this on because it makes it much easier to watch. If you turn it off, you're going to have a lot more settings to do later on. So I always leave it on. Next to that, you have identified tracking targets that you can also leave on because it might come in handy later if you want to track, or if you want it to automatically track targets for you, so you have to do less work. Below that, we have direction lock. So this, you're gonna have to decide what you want to achieve, and then you can only decide whether you want it on or off. So first, I'll show you what it looks like with it on. Okay, so here is me riding along, just about to go around a corner with direction lock turned on. So if I just push play, you'll notice that the camera keeps pointing at the bike while we go around the corner. So now I'm going to scrub back to where we were just before we went around the corner, but this time I'm going to turn direction lock off. So now if we line it up with the bike again and push play, you'll notice that the camera stays in line with the surroundings. It's not concerned with what it's mounted to, which in this case is the bike. So if we push play and you look at that little tree on the left, you'll see how the bike slowly moves out of frame. So for that shot, it actually works quite well because the bike moves around in the frame, so it looks cool. So in this case, you could even leave it turned off and still get a cool shot. But if it was, say, a hairpin bend, the bike would completely move out of frame. So then you would probably want direction lock turned on so that your framing, at least according to the bike, stays consistent. So heading back into settings, below that we have a color tab with Aquavision 2.0. We're not underwater, so you don't need that turned on. And if you are underwater on a motorbike, you shouldn't be watching this video. You have bigger problems than that. Next to that, you have chromatic calibration, which you should always just leave on because it will make your footage look slightly better. And finally, we have logo. If you want to give Insta360 free advertising, turn that on. Back to the top next to basic, we have another tab called accessories. Basically, if you had any accessories on your camera, turn that on so that it can compensate the stitch line to accommodate your accessories. So for example, if you were doing motocross and you didn't want your lens to get damaged, then it's a good idea to put your sticky lens guards on, and in which case you would turn this setting on so that it automatically compensates for you. But in this case, I was filming just like this, so none of these apply to me. And the final tab is edit data, which you don't need to worry about for what we're doing today. So next, I'm going to show you how to add a movement to the clip. So I've scrubbed back to a section of footage that I really like. We've got the bike looking good in the shadows, we've got some clouds and blue sky, and some beautiful trees off to the right. So this is my plan. I'm going to start by looking at the bike. As I ride along, we're going to look up to the trees and then swing around back to the bike. So this is how you would do that. The first thing you need to do is go to where you'd like the clip to start. So I've done that, and now is when we're going to start using the timeline at the bottom. You can see the big yellow circle with the plus in it, and we're going to hit that to add a keyframe to our timeline. And now you can see we have a whole new bunch of controls. So on the left we have FOV, or field of view. And if you click that, you can see we have a few options. We have tiny planet, which looks like this, ultra wide, which is as it is wide, and it gradually just gets closer to the bike. So for this, we're going to stick with ultra wide because that's what looks cool. And you can even pinch in and out to get the perfect field of view for you. Personally, I want it even a little bit wider. If we were to just press play now, the camera would be locked on to looking at the bike. So everywhere I ride, this would be the view that we're getting. But remember, that's not what we want. I wanted it to go from looking at the bike to looking up at the trees. So how we're going to do that is press play and let me ride along for a few more seconds. Now we're going to pause it again and set our new keyframe with some new attributes. So first, I'm going to drag the camera to looking at the trees because that is what I want. Then I'm going to click the add keyframe button, which will bring up our field of view settings. And now I'm going to choose linear so that we're more zoomed in on the trees and we're going to get a different view. The cool thing about a keyframe is that it remembers all the attributes you set. So if we go back to our first keyframe, it's still looking at the bike exactly how we left it. And if we jump forward to our new one, it's looking at the trees exactly how we left it. So if we were to push play now from the first keyframe, the camera is going to move from point A to point B, and that is how you make a camera movement. Pretty satisfying. Now, if we jump back to the second keyframe, I want the camera to keep looking at the trees for a few seconds. So all I'm going to do is push play, let it run for a second or two, push pause, and then add a keyframe right there. So now nothing is going to change between those two keyframes. We're going to be looking at the trees. But now we want the camera to come back to looking at the bike. So what I'm going to do is again press play, let it run for a few seconds, pause it when I want it to be back at looking at the bike, drag the camera back to the motorcycle, and now we can add our keyframe and choose our field of view, which in this case is going to be even wider than ultra wide. So now hopefully when we watch the whole thing back, it should look exactly how I planned. So let's assume that's the clip that you wanted, and now you want to export it so you can upload it to Instagram. All you're going to do is go back to the start of the clip, and I want it to be looking at the bike for a few seconds before that, so I'm going to scrub before that. Then we're going to hit the trim icon, and now we can literally just drag the playheads to where we want them to be. So for example, here's where I'm going to let it start, and then as my movement finishes, that's where we're going to cut it. Then all you do is click the plus sign to save it, and then in the top right hand corner there's the big yellow export button, and it's as simple as it looks. So then it gives you a few options to export. You can obviously export in flat or 360, but since we just put all this effort into editing the footage, we should export it in flat to save our settings. Then you get a few options of where to save it. You can save it to your phone's album, or you can export it directly to places like the Insta360 app, Facebook or Instagram. I'm just going to save it to my album. And then you get your export settings. You can get your custom settings, which you can set up if you want anything different, or you can just copy the settings that the video already had, which is what I'm going to do. And all you have to do is hit the export button and it will save it to your phone's album. So those are the basics and pretty much everything you need to get started editing your 360 clips. If you know the basics, you can get something pretty cool with nice movements. Of course, there are a ton more options using AI features. There's options like Motion ND, but once you master the basics, you can start playing around with those and see what they do for yourself. To get your footage off of the camera and onto a computer, you have two options. Option one is a good old-fashioned USB-C cable, or option two, which is a little bit easier, is something like an SD card reader. You'll see that each clip is made up of multiple files. Make sure to bring all of the files off of the camera and onto your computer because it affects how the Studio app reads them. Now with all of the files on your computer, open up the Insta360 Studio and then simply select all of those files and drag them into Insta360 Studio, where it will condense them into just the clips that you filmed. On the left, you'll see all of the clips you just imported. On the right, you'll see the settings for that selected clip. And at the bottom, you'll see the timeline, which is where all the magic happens with keyframes. So I'm going to select this clip to start messing around with. The first thing I like to do is choose my aspect ratio, which you can find in the bottom right-hand corner of the video itself. You can see the three circles. The bottom is to go to full screen. Above that is to take a snapshot. And above that is our aspect ratio. Again, we have 5 options this time. We have a square, we have vertical, horizontal, 4:3, that's very old-fashioned, and ultra widescreen in case you film in a movie. So for this, I'm editing in horizontal on a computer, so I'm gonna go with 16:9 so that it matches, and that will be perfect for a YouTube video. So next, I'm gonna go through the settings on the right-hand side. You wanna make sure that you figure these out first before adding keyframes, because if you change these settings after you've added keyframes, it'll mess all of them up and you'll have to redo them completely. So you can see on the right, we have sort of 6 tabs. The top one is stabilization type. And the first one is flow state stabilization, and you can see it defaults to being turned on because most likely you're going to want it turned on. For example, this is me riding down the road with stabilization turned on. So no matter what, the horizon stays level and everything is nice and smooth. Then if we go and switch it off, you can see the horizon isn't even level. You have to do that manually and everything will be very rough and a lot of vibrations. Underneath that, you'll find direction lock. So this is where the camera is going to lock onto. Is it going to be locked onto what the camera is mounted to or locked onto the environment around it? So let's start with direction lock turned off. You can see here I'm going around a corner, so keep your eye on the tree in the background. As I push play, the camera is going to stay pointing in that direction and the bike is going to move within the frame. So if we skim back to where we started and now turn direction lock turned on, This time, keep your eye on the tree and the bike. If we push play, you can see that the camera is now locked onto the bike and the environment around it moves. For what I want to achieve today, I'm going to leave direction lock on, and I do most of the time. But play around with it because you can find what works for what you're trying to achieve. The next tab is stitching. So if you have any accessories on your camera, like a sticky lens guard to protect it from rocks, or maybe you were diving underwater so you had a dive case on it, you simply click that and it automatically compensates the stitch line for your accessories. So I was filming exactly like this, so I'm going to leave it as normal so it looks as good as possible. So below that we have stitching optimization. Basically you have two options. You have dynamic stitching and optical flow stitching. Because you can see if I turn optical flow stitching on, it automatically turns dynamic stitching off. So I usually just toggle between them to see which one looks the best. As you switch between them, you can actually see the stitch line changing. So personally, I think the optical flow stitching looks better, so I'm going to leave it at that. And below that we have chromatic calibration, which you should just leave on because it will make your footage look slightly better. You don't really need to worry about calibrating your stitch line unless you're getting really fancy. The next tab is media processing. This is where you can turn things on like color plus, which will make it look more or less saturated. We have clarity, which will make it look sharper. Motion ND, which will make the background look blurred, which could be cool to play around with. But for now, we're just going to focus on the basics. So this is the last stuff we're going to focus on this side of the screen. So now that we have our base settings sorted down, we're going to turn our attention down to the timeline and we're going to start adding keyframes to add movements to the shot. The first thing you want to do is scrub to where you're going to want your clip to start. So I think I want mine to start somewhere around here. It's a pretty shot. The bike's looking good. There's some trees to the right that we could look at for a few seconds, going around a corner. So we're going to stop where we want the clip to start. And the first thing we're going to do is come down just above the timeline on the right. There's a plus, which is how you add a keyframe. So we're going to do that. This brings up your field of view settings. So we have our default, which is very wide. We have a crystal ball, which looks ridiculous. I don't know who uses that. Tiny planet, which can be really cool, and then all the others are basically just varying degrees of how far it is from the bike. So I'm going to stick with default because I like the way it looks. And below that you have your numeric control, so you can sort of manipulate them that way if that's better. But personally, I like just dragging around on the frame because it's more natural for small-minded people like me. So let's say all you wanted to do was track the bike along this exact framing for your whole clip. Now we've already added a keyframe, so in theory if we skim ahead, the bike should still be in the center of the frame. That is pretty much the easiest way, but if you find the bike drifting out of the frame, even like doing this, if you go next to where we added a keyframe, you can find deep track. So if you select that, it'll let you literally drag over whatever you want to track. On the right there's a box to tick that says center the target, which is what we want to achieve, and then you literally say start tracking. So here you can see it's chosen the seat cowl for some reason, but it will still sort of get us the same result. So we just let it play for as long as we'd like to track the bike and then say stop tracking. So if we go back to the start, you can see the yellow piece where it did track the bike and push play. You can see, just like we wanted it to do, the seat cowl is right in the center of the frame, so the bike is being tracked. You can do it with people or cars coming past. There's plenty options. So for now, I'm just going to delete that because that's not what we want to do. I want to make a camera movement that goes from looking at the bike, then up to the trees, and then back to the bike, all while riding along this corner. The first thing we need to do is add a keyframe. This is going to assign all the information we choose to that point in the video. So if I just push play, we're going to keep looking at the bike. I'm going to stop it a few seconds later because this is where I want to look up to the trees. So we're going to add our second keyframe, look up to the trees, change our field of view to something a bit more zoomed in, like linear. And then if we go back to our first keyframe and push play, it should be the camera movement we want. So you can see that did exactly what we planned. Now I want to look at the trees for a second or two. So I'm going to push play, stop it, add another keyframe, and now nothing is going to change between those two frames, or keyframes. We're going to continue looking at the trees. After that, I want it to play for another few seconds, and then about here, I want to be looking back at the bike. So once again, I'm going to add a keyframe, then drag the frame back to the bike, and this is going to be what we want. Don't forget to change your framing choose how it looks. I think that looks quite nice. So in theory, this should be our camera movement completed. So that worked exactly as we planned. Those are just some of the basic things you need to create a camera movement, and then you can start to get fancy with it. But like this, you can already make a really cool clip. One way you can make these camera movements even cooler is if you zoom in and then click on the little line between the two keyframes. This brings up different ways you can change between the keyframes. So you can see here, it's automatically set to smooth dissolve. So that just goes a very consistent speed from one keyframe to the next. But we have other options like slip in, fade out. So in other words, the speed's gonna start fast and slow down. So it should look like this. So you can see it starts off very fast and then slows down. You can do the opposite too. You can make it start slow and speed up, or it can start fast, get slow, and end fast. It can make the transitions look much more exciting and less formal. I don't do it nearly as often as I should. So I'm gonna leave that transition set there. I'm gonna go to the end where we look back at the bike and make it start fast and end slow, and assume that is the clip we want, and now we want to export it. So all I'm gonna do is put my playhead a few seconds before the start of my first keyframe, and then above that, you can see there's a mark as trim start, and we're gonna click that. Then I'm gonna go to where the camera looks back to the bike at the end, let it play for a few more seconds, and then go mark as trim end above the timeline. So now if we go to the far right of the timeline, there's the big yellow square with the arrow in it, and that's how we export. If we do that, it's gonna export what we just trimmed. So here we have our export settings. The first thing we can do is name our clip, which I'm gonna call Aprilia. Then it's gonna save to my desktop. You can choose where you want it. I'm happy with that. And then below that, we have all our settings, which is basically just going to mimic what the camera did while filming, which I'm perfectly happy with. Below that, we have two options. We can either export immediately or add to queue. So if you have lots of clips that you want to edit and then export them as a batch later on, this is what you would do. You would just add to queue, and when you've edited all your clips, you export them all in one go. The only thing you do have to be careful of is that if you went back to the clip that you've already added to the queue and changed something within it, like your aspect ratio or a keyframe, that will affect the edit you've already set to export. So just be careful with that. But I'm happy with this, so I'm gonna just export as is. And that's it. Those might just be the basics, but that's all you really need to start making some really cool clips with Insta360 cameras. You can obviously get far more adventurous with things like time shift that you'll find within the app, but as long as you master the basics, these will be a lot of fun to play with. But anyway, let me know whether you prefer editing on mobile or on a computer. Tag me in your 360 videos, and I'll see you on the next ride.